Now, whereas Tiziana, like most of you, is a more recent member of the Graduate School of Social Work, Kathleen McInnis-Dittrich is a very, very old member of this community. Yeah, Katie's voice is among the most, and maybe her voice is the most favorite and one of the most valued voices in the Graduate School of Social Work, especially among students. As the teaching chair in the School of Social Work and the chair of the Older Adults and Family Concentration, Katie's voice has teased us and taught us and challenged us and always encouraged us to go farther and to go braver in our diversity conversation. And we're really lucky to have her here this afternoon. So, Katie.
For the students in my macro class who knew I was a wreck about doing my regatta, I did not drown and I did not come in last. So we have made our goals here. We're not going into a lot of details about where I am in between all that, but I was very pleased that this year the topic or the population that was chosen to talk about in the issue of diversity was older adults. And it's one of the few populations that in disability that you will grow into aging or you'll die. Those are the only two choices. So this isn't sort of a group that you can avoid. There will not be a student who is in this room who will not be affected by the changes that are occurring demographically with an older population. You cannot ignore this. It's incredibly important. Just as a little levity here, I adore older people. Pictures of old people, stories about old people, whatever. So anyway, these are pictures of what I think are some of the most beautiful older women I've ever seen. But what I want you to look at, who looks happier, women or men? And I want, for the sake of my colleagues who are New York Yankees fans, that's for you. Those happy faces, not to rub it in, but the Red Sox did win 3 out of 4 this weekend, so we need to be happy. And Johnny Pesky doesn't necessarily look happy, he's dead, so... and not to make light of that. Okay, one of the things that I've certainly in conversations that I've had with students over the last, 20 years, as I'm so old, thank you, Paul, for making me aware of, because I'm one of the older ones. Some of the conversations I've certainly heard in the last couple years, anybody but old people. I don't want to work with old people. Don't make me work with old people. And the field people have certainly heard this. And that if I die if I had to work with old people. So my comment to that is, don't worry, they're going to beat you to it. But on a more serious note, what if we said these things? What if we said anybody but gay guys, anybody? What if we said, please don't make me work with people with disabilities? Or what if we said, I'd die if I had to work with Latinos? That is not acceptable. And it's not acceptable in the field situation where people go in and go, can't do gay, can't do that gay thing. Can't do that Latin thing, can't do that. I just don't like those people. Disabilities depress me. I don't want to work with whatever. But we accept I don't want to work with older adults all the time. And we do it in terms of even being our own subtle kinds of acceptance of that type of ageist attitude. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit of how that whole concept of social justice really affects the way that we treat older adults and why they are emerging as this unbelievably important component in the discussion about diversity. Ageism is one of the last forms of discrimination that is tolerated. And it is tolerated. Where else do you have products on TV, to look younger, take 10 years off your life? What if they had something that said, here, white cover girl? They would never have a product like that. But they have all kinds of anti-aging creams. So what happens over time is it seeps into our consciousness, and we don't even realize how much that becomes an issue in discrimination. There's a growing population of older adults. You don't need to hear this. You've heard this a million times. By 2030, 1 out of 5 people will be over the age of 65. In my neighborhood, that's now. I live in West Roxbury. It's one of the naturally occurring retirement communities in the city of Boston. It's 1 in 25 over age 60 right now. Bunch of old folks living in West Roxbury. But it will continue, it will be 20% of the population, 20%, 1 out of 5 people. Everybody who's going to be 65 5 years from now is alive. Why is this such a surprise? Do not call this the gray tsunami. Tsunami kills people. Tsunami wipes people out. It destroys where people live. Old people do not do that. Please don't use that phrase. Though the older adults are vulnerable because of physical, social, and economic needs, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, people grow into it. And I'm calling my talk today growing into social injustice. They don't start out there. We grow into it. That people have been high functioning and had all kinds of opportunities their whole life will lose some of those when they get older. Something is wrong. And even at our table, briefly, I was talking about something is wrong that there are hungry kids, and something is wrong that there are older adults. In a situation like Tiziana was talking about, we have to make that decision. So do we homeless mothers, or do we do poor, developmentally disabled old people? Who gets the axe? And then even having to have that kind of discussion, what we've seen politically for the last 50 years is the pie has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, and the people who are advocates for children are fighting for the people who are advocates for older adults, who are fighting for the people who are advocates for homeless folks, and politicians don't have to do a darn thing about it because they made the pie so small and they threw the cookie on the table and said, let them fight over it because we're not making that decision. So we have certainly seen this move into a different thing. I'm a walker in West Roxbury. I know every dog, every older person, every kid who's on a skateboard. You just learn all kinds of things when you walk in a neighborhood. And I walk with a man, not so much now because he's not been well lately, named Augie. And I was walking with, and walking is an exaggeration, trust me. We more like do the shuffle because he's pretty slow. But anyway, we're walking along, and the skateboarders came zooming by and almost threw us into the bushes. And Augie was probably about 6'5", 6'6" before he got sick, and he has an osteoporotic spine, so he's bent over. And anyway, we almost have our little time in the bushes there from the kids. And I look over and Augie's crying. I said, what is wrong? He said, if they had said, dirty old man, get off the street, I wouldn't have cared as much as the fact they didn't see me. I feel invisible. And I think that is an issue when we talk about social justice. The populations oftentimes that we're talking about, whether they're older adults or whether they're people of color or whether they're gay, lesbian, transgendered bi populations, they become invisible. Or we want them to stay invisible. All of this is a lot easier to do when we can't see people, a lot easier. If you have not seen the movie The Butler, must see, must see, must see. Because the character who is the butler in that movie goes from being a field hand in a cotton field in the South to being a butler in the White House. He is told from the time he becomes a house Negro, and those are not the words used in the movie, that the way for him to survive is to be in the room and no one knows he's there. He has internalized to be invisible. Meanwhile, he's raising a son who doesn't want to be invisible, who believes that that time is gone, that he needs to be seen. And the movie is a wonderful sort of juxtaposition of, get along to get along, or whether or not you stand up and fight for your own rights. And I think that that's incredibly important when we look at older adults. Now, the reason that working with older adults and our attention and our necessity of paying attention to older adults is a social justice issue is, first of all, because it's about human dignity and oppression. And we're going to see in just a second, it is legal to discriminate on the basis of age after age 70 in the workplace. People are only protected between 40 and 70, not after that. It is legal to say for some housing discrimination for people, especially if it's a house, some housing arrangement that may not be ADA certifiable, that they can get away with that. It's also an issue of human dignity. What is wrong with a society where people lose their dignity when they get older and we relegate them to live in substandard care? That is a human dignity issue. Also, older adults are marginalized. That's another component when we talk about what is social justice. Paying attention to populations that are marginalized. Also, inequities affect life chances. That's a social justice issue. When people don't get adequate health care, it affects their life chances. When people live in substandard housing, it affects their life chances. And when people are medicated into oblivion in nursing homes, it affects their life chances. It's a social justice issue. And last, anytime we construct barriers to full participation, that's a social justice issue. And older adults are great examples of that. And the one that always makes me crazy is the issue of driving. I don't like being behind some older drivers any more than anybody else. It's the reason I avoid, like Roach's Market, on Wednesdays. That's 5% discount for senior citizens. And the driving in the parking lot is just out of this world. So bad. I don't even go out of the house on that day because it's so terrible in my neighborhood. But what do we do if you take people's driver's licenses away? We relegate them to being prisoners in their own home, and then we yell at them because they're socially isolated. Okay, I'm going to go through these and identify why, when we're talking about older adults, this is such a relevant issue. In the first one, social justice is about preserving human dignity and addressing oppression. Let me use the example of LGBT older adults. This may be the most difficult population in terms of the kinds of things that they have to face. LGBT older adults are far less likely to seek health care, although they have greater health problems. I have a PhD student now working on a study where one of the things that older adults may be out to everybody in their whole circle of friends except their physician because they're afraid of what their physician will say or how that will affect the quality of that relationship. Long-term care facilities don't know what to do with the LGBT older population. They don't know what to do. I mean, they don't do very well dealing with older people in general, but you put together an LGBT couple and they can't deal with it. They're not well trained. One of my neighbors died about 5 years ago, but before he died, he needed home health care. And I said, Lee, you need to get a health care aide in here. And he goes, I can't wait to see if someone can deal with the gay thing. This is a 65-year-old gay man who is so intimidated by what a home health care aide might say to him, how he might be treated, that he can't even say, I'm afraid someone's going to come in here and not treat me well because I'm gay. There is something wrong with that. Older adults, whether they're 65, 105, or 15, are in a legal limbo in 36 states in this country. And you will find you're very lucky to be living in Massachusetts. We've got a black governor, we got gay marriage, we got all kinds of things going on that sometimes lead us to forget that that is not the situation in every single state in the United States. So we see then LGBT older adults are in double jeopardy. They are old and they are LGBT. And we haven't even added the race card yet. That's coming in a point. For older adults of color, they have lower retirement incomes because they had lower incomes their entire life. So the deck is stacked against you when you're 15, and it's going to stay stacked till you're 115 at that point. So we see coming up against that, whether you're working, you're behind off, or no matter what you're doing, most older adults of color will have lower retirement incomes, which means you start out poor or you start out working class and you stay there because you never get past that. Older adults of color have a decreased life expectancy because of a lifetime of poor access to health care, because of some prenatal and childhood kinds of things that happen. From day one, the deck is stacked against them. Older adults of color have more chronic illness and receive a lower quality of care. Lifetime access to health care. It's not good when they're 5. It's not much better when they're 65. There are cumulative effects of an entire lifetime of having access to only substandard kinds of care. That's a triple jeopardy. So they are now old and they are of color. And so we are seeing that these kinds of things stack up and accumulate, and so that every year older for older adults of color, and LGBT older adults of color, and LGBT older adults is one more thing stacked against them in terms of getting adequate care. Let's talk about the problem of marginalization, which is another component when we're talking about social justice. Clearly for older adults, healthcare financing reduces the quality of care. Those nursing homes, those healthcare facilities that will take Title 19 Mass Health in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, with some exception, do not have access to the same kinds of care that more affluent hospitals do. And it's not that the people who work there don't care. They do care. They only don't have access to the same kinds of medical services. So people don't get the same kinds of care. And if you are old and sick, you better hope you get picked up by a ambulance in Newton to go to Newton Wellesley, because it's going to be a heck of a lot different than going to Boston Medical Center, which is where most low-income older adults will end up. Another issue in addressing the problem of marginalization, medicine does a great job avoiding older adults. We will need 70,000 social workers to work with older adults, new not replacement, new social workers to work with older adults in the next 20 years. We need almost the same number of geriatricians, and we're probably not going to have 1,000. It is the least popular of all the medical specialties, and it's I don't want to work with old people issue that's going on. And what are we going to do when 20% of the population is over the age of 65 and we don't have anywhere near enough geriatricians to answer those kinds of things? And when you think about this, think about your parents, think about your grandparents, because this is already affecting you in ways you may not even know. We also, just to go back to the over-medication piece, the number one way to control older adults' behavior in nursing homes is to medicate the living daylights out of them. So you walk in and their heads bopped over and they're drooling. Good way to control people. We never get away with that with the younger population. What if people were advocating to drug the daylights out of 15-year-old kids who are poorly behaved? They would never tolerate that. We tolerate it with older adults all the time and go, Mom, what else can they do, right? Chemical restraints, that's what they call them. The system in the United States forces old people to be poor before they get decent care. Nursing homes in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts run somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000, depending on where it is, and that will be all private pay patients until they absolutely have nothing left. When you have spent every single cent you have and earned in your entire lifetime, the state will take over. But that can you imagine at $15,000 a month how long people's expenses? It doesn't. It forces people into poverty in order to receive care at all. Also, we terrorize older adults in and out of advanced planning for end of life. They threw out the death panels on the Affordable Care Act. They weren't death panels, for God's sakes. They were going to pay physicians to have a conversation about end-of-life care. And everyone said, oh, then the physicians will decide who will and who won't, who isn't worthy to stay alive. That is not what that meant. And it got thrown out before anybody even tried to look at it. We can't have that conversation for older adults. I'm thinking of the conversation about do not resuscitate. A lot of physicians, and I've heard this, a physician said this to me on the phone about my own mother. Look what shape she's in. If, God forbid, her heart stops, you don't want us to try to bring her back, do you? I said, why don't you ask her? She's right there. He's having a conversation. My mother was perfectly lucid. And the attitude was, we don't want to, we can't bring her back when they're that bad, so let's just have a do not resuscitate. Some people are afraid of having an advance directive because they don't want someone to pull the plug. That's not what advance directives are. If you want all the details on advance directives, take the Dying, Grief, and Bereavement class, because we go into that. This brings me to sort of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's disease has a multiplier of 10, meaning for every case of Alzheimer's, there are 10 people who are directly affected by it. By 2050, 15 million minimum people in the United States will have Alzheimer's disease. That means 150 million Americans will be affected directly by someone who has Alzheimer's. And I guarantee if we took a survey in this class right now that there's easily out of are there 120 people maybe in here, maybe not that many, that there would easily be 45 to 50 people who are directly affected by someone with Alzheimer's. And we have to really pay attention. And what makes this really pathetic is how little money we spend on it. This is where the old 60s part of me comes out. I am old, Paul. You are right. The cost of the war in Afghanistan in 2012, one year, $198 billion. 1 year, and we're coming home with mud on our face and for all basic purposes, made a big mess of the whole thing. Tobacco subsidies in 2012, tobacco subsidies for which they're spending how many $1 billion to get people not to start smoking in the first place? $191 million on tobacco subsidies. Something is wrong with that. Military golf courses, love to go after the military because they have this horrible $140 million on military golf courses. And I love to golf, and I think it's too much. Now let's take the other side of it. NIH spending, research on all types of disease, $30.9 billion, that's total. That's 1 year, 30.9. But that's still 1/6 of what we spent on the war in Afghanistan, which we're on our way out of right now, and only $448 million in Alzheimer's research. 150 million people are going to be affected indirectly or directly by Alzheimer's disease by 2030, and all we can spend on research is $448 million. I couldn't even pull up what the research that's being done on plantar fasciitis, which you have, it is very painful, but on the other hand, it's nothing compared to Alzheimer's disease. We put our money where our mouth is, and this is where we're putting our money. And this is telling us something about, and we were having this discussion at our table about, how do you make a decision about the money piece? So we let the people fight. We let social services fight over the cookie. That's one way to do it. And the other point is that even looking at wasteful spending, I think we could certainly improve the amount of money that was spent on that. But this is not enough. A third part of addressing this social justice issue when we're talking about older adults is really correcting the inequities that affect life chances. And the areas I'm describing right here are critically important. Access to quality health and mental health care. There is not an equity in terms of access to health care and mental health care if it's covered by Medicare, which is the insurance program that covers most older adults. One of the reasons that we talk till we're blue in the face about this importance of mental health care for older adults, and private clinicians are saying we don't get reimbursed enough to make it worth it. We don't get paid enough. Nobody who takes Medicare patients gets paid enough. I have seen those Medicare bills come in as I look at stuff from my mother, and they're billing at if this minor surgical procedure for $400, and the Medicare reimbursement is like $28. How long do you think physicians are going to stand to take that where they can't? That's not even covering their costs at that point. But that's all we're paying people. That's all we're paying people. So there's inadequate mental health care. It's easier to drug people than it is to treat the issue. We also need to look at supporting family caregivers. People who keep individuals at home who have Alzheimer's are saving the U.S. government $4.9 billion with a B dollars every single year by not putting those people into nursing homes or to more structured care. Almost $5 billion on just Alzheimer's. They're saving the government that amount of money, and we give them no support. We give them very little support in terms of support groups, in terms of any type of respite care that's going on. It's sort of like, isn't that wonderful? You're taking care of your aging mother, period. However, we're not going to cut you a break for anything that's going on in your job. We're not going to give any type of tax incentives for that. And people are supposed to simply do it out of the goodness of their heart. We're not supporting the people who are offering that service. Affordable housing. Boston's a great example. It's just older adults cannot afford the house that they have. And I'm thinking of Beacon Hill Village, which is a virtual retirement community. Many people, older people living in Beacon Village, beautiful, beautiful homes. Huge, nice, good property worth for that. They can't afford the taxes. So they can't afford to stay in the homes that they've raised their families in because the taxes are so amazingly high. And that when you look at low-income older adults, unless they qualify for public housing, are relegated to live in substandard care. The last part of this particular issue is the importance of us supporting grandfamilies. And this should be really important to those of you who are interested in working with children and youth and family. Is that there are lots of times when grandparents take over and pick up raising with the kid if something happens to the parent. So that whether the parent's incarcerated or ill or whatever the case may be, it's grandfamilies, it's grandparents who are keeping those kids out of foster homes. And we offer them virtually no support. I think it's a very invisible part of the population of older adults. Another interesting thing that happens here is what we call a crossover effect. Older adults of color have a shorter lifespan than white older adults, but if they make it to 75, they'll probably make it to 90. It's called crossover effect. It's sort of like, if you're a tough bird at 75, we'll give it till 90 at that point. So it's sort of this interesting disparity here. They have that increased chance of living into their 90s, but look at this. Female, poor, with a chronic illness, living in substandard care, widowed or single, it's quintuple jeopardy. Yes, quintuple is a word. I did look it up. That's 5 times. It's not just the color, not just the gender. It's the fact that you're poor with a chronic illness, and then people are facing tremendous obstacles. The last part of this, attention to social justice, is the importance of removing barriers to full participation by older adults. There was, in the history of gerontology in the 50s, a whole school of thought that felt that older adults needed to disengage. That was a group of sociologists who said everyone would do better if older adults disengaged and sort of made room for the younger population. Well, 1 in 5 people were not over the age of 65. And we learned very quickly that social isolation, whether you're 5, 15, 25, or 65, or 105, is very, very dangerous. So we quickly disbanded that. But what we're doing is older adults live to be older and are staying in the community, or we'd like them to stay in the community. They're coming up against barriers in full participation, driving or the death sentence. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I think especially the baby boomer, we are the rabbit in the boa constrictor, as they say. We'll have changed everything from the time that they were born between 47 and 64, change every single social institution, and will continue to change as that population gets older. If we say to older adults, you shouldn't be driving, it's a death sentence if there's no public transportation. How do they ever get out? Oh, we'll bring them, we'll bring their food to them, and, they can watch TV and all this. Social isolation is what kills older adults. So by taking away the driver's license, we are sentencing them to be prisoners in their own home unless we come up with something else. What about workers over 70 years of age? Like I said earlier today, it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of age between 40 and 70. It is at 25, however, so just remember that when you're going to find a job, that it is legal to discriminate on the basis of age at age 25. What do we do about workers over 70? What do we do about the population of older adults who have to continue to work? They can't afford to retire. This idea that they're going to retire and go to spring training, which is my aspiration, by the way, you can't do that. It's not going to happen. People don't have the money. And part of that can even be your own parents' generation who had to spend so much money to educate you and for their own health issues that they can't afford to retire at 65. That's a joke. It isn't going to happen. It's not going to happen. What about the donut hole for services? Now, the donut hole always has historically referred to the gap in between where pharmacy insurance under Medicare covers people's prescriptions and not. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that if you have nothing, you probably have access to services. And if you're loaded, you have access to services. But if you're anywhere in between there, you don't. And that's pretty much everybody who's in between dirt poor and filthy rich. In terms of being able to get services and needing to pay for them, and people don't have enough money. And they but they talk about older adults eating cat food or eating other type of pet food because they can't afford full and nutritious meals. It happens because it's cheap food, and it may be all that people have. The median amount that people have saved for retirement among the baby boomers right now, saved, median, meaning middle number, $50,000. $50,000 is not going to last people very long in retirement. There are going to be people who are quite affluent now who will have nothing and will have probably maybe $2,000 a month for Social Security, but they're not going to have enough to live on. And the people who will take a lifestyle drop as a result of this. And what erroneous assumptions do we have about the classes? What's interesting is age is one of the great levelers in some respects. We see populations working with older adults of different economic levels and see, unfortunately, some of the same things. I had a student last year who was working at Newbridge on the Charles, which very expensive, lovely, lovely facility, lovely, lovely. Old people who have money and can afford to live there suffer from the pain of isolation, social isolation, as much as, if not more, than people who have less. And one of the reasons about it being more is because they have made assumptions about people will be there for them, there will be these kinds of services, I've always lived at this level, and it doesn't happen when they get old. What about other things? What about social isolation? This is one of my greatest concerns, is what happens to older people in terms of who never see anybody during the day. Social isolation is a way to kill people. But because older adults are semi-invisible, they're not even seen that way. One of the assignments I give in my social work 823, which is mental health with older adults, is to do an observation of an older adult for 15 minutes. And many of my students say, I don't see any old people all week. I can't do this. I don't see any old people. I said, yeah, you do. You just don't see them. They're there. You tell me, you go through an entire week and tell me you did not see one older person. So then they come back with, oh my gosh, there's 50 old people at my CVS, and Starbucks is overrun with them, and it's a little bit like, open up your eyes, people, because they're clearly there. Financial abuse, horrible problem with older adults, and abuse systematically by people who are going out to really relieve older adults of their money, and that's done oftentimes. The worst offenders are adult children, actually. What about the problem of self-neglect? How sad is that to see an older adult who's homeless, who is and self-neglecting? And the bottom line is, for an older adult who is self-neglecting and has full mental capacity, we can't do anything about it. We can't do anything about it. And this last point really is sort of, what are we doing? I mean, our healthcare system, I think, is raising so many interesting issues. We go through millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of bucks to save older adults, and then they die of something else. Or as they say in the Alzheimer's biz, if you live long enough, everyone's going to get Alzheimer's. We keep people alive long enough with all kinds of extraordinary medical care so that Alzheimer's can kill them. And I think there's a real ethical problem with that. So let me just sort of summarize why I think aging is such a significant social justice issue. There will be other speakers who will come this week and during this year to talk about this issue, and I hope that every single one of them is a little bit angry. I think that anger and fear are two very powerful motivators. If you're in the joint degree program over in pastoral ministry, the Enneagram identifies people who are 8s as being highly motivated by anger. I'm an 8. I'm a screaming 8. I'm married to a 5. We have our challenges, if you know anything about the Enneagram. That's operating a very different motivation. But I think that we need, in this conversation that we're having about older adults and social justice, to really bring people to the point of being angry enough about what they see, and to be concerned enough and to be scared enough about their own future to want to do something. So let me just summarize. Aging and looking at aging and attention to aging is an issue in addressing human dignity and avoiding oppression and depression, by the way. That's a purposeful Freudian slip. But because they are seen as such a powerless population. But I'll tell you, in the city of Boston, the number one group that shows up to vote are older adults. Almost anywhere in the country, the greatest number of votes proportionately are cast by older adults. Because I live in an older neighborhood, every single person running for mayor is going to be kissing our butt this entire fall around that, because they know people will show up to vote at that point. They're powerful. They haven't even started to flex their political muscles. Older adults are marginalized, and by the fact that we see them as somewhat invisible, and we allow it to happen. We allow them to be pushed to the back, and that is just an example of marginalization. We present older adults with inequities that affect their life chances. Poor medical care, substandard housing, not decent transportation, poor access to further medical knowledge through research. I mean, we're shortchanging older adults. And I'm not going to say because they've given us their life. That's about pity. What I don't want you to feel today, I don't want you to feel sorry for older adults. Pity and sympathy are the most destructive human emotions on the planet. It is destructive. Don't pity them. Pity, it comes from a position of power. You're pitying those people when you have more power than they do. And the last point is barriers to full participation. That although we talk about we should for older adults, what are we doing to allow them to have access to full participation? So then if we're looking in terms of what is the first step, sort of a final thought, as I said, I wish at this point, although I wouldn't have a job when I'd be done with this. Oh, I would, but I wouldn't have a happy dean. I always feel like I should say, go blow something up, right? Let's call attention. But I'm not. I am not telling you that. Let's make that perfectly clear. See, I'm not telling him that, okay? I don't want him to catch me on the way out. And I wish that I could make all of you angry here today, because I think anger around issues in social justice can be incredibly motivating, because I think it takes people to a place where they say, I'm not going to put up with that. I'm not going to do that. And it was when populations of color got angry and pushed back that things started to change. And it's when LGBT populations got angry and began to push back that things began to change. It became when populations with disabilities pushed back that something began to change, because they wanted to not be invisible. And that is the first step. So what I want you to do as we move along this year, what in the situation of older adults, I want you to look. Just look. Thank you.
So if I can invite you just to stand up for a second. Yeah. You might not have done it on your own, but I think Tiziana and Katie deserve a standing ovation. Thank you.